needs some kind of empirics to support the claim that it is due to Protestant doctrines that individual Protestants here are driven to producing, let's say, more micro-level phenomena in the work world or in just the world of consumption and wealth that eventually then through an aggregation mechanism leads to the macro phenomenon of rational capitalism. And in this reconstruction, one can identify at least these four different micro sort of mechanisms through which the macro Protestantist doctrines lead to this final outcome. And the main sort of top-down kind of mechanisms to which the individual Protestants then are, let's say, influenced is religious organizations. So Weber emphasizes that Protestant religion, in comparison to Catholic religion, has, let's say, leaves the individual alone. There is this idea that basically laymen pastors are legitimate in the Catholic Church. It's clear that you have the professional priest, and this is different from then the, let's say, Catholic believers who are a step below, but they also don't have to worry so much about the most fundamental questions and doubts of their religion. This is also something that is, let's say, more socially organized. Catholic religions has these charity funds and so on. So individualistic organization of religions is one of the contextual factors that influences the individual Protestants as much as does the different ways of schooling. So these are just socialization mechanisms, if you want, for the individual Protestant. Then the individual Protestant, so the main puzzle that Weber probably wants to answer in the Protestant ethics is, why is it that all of a sudden Protestants start working beyond their needs? Why do they do overwork? Why do they are not satisfied anymore with just stopping working when all needs are satisfied? Why do they just continue working? And this is where Weber's idea of a professional calling or work as a vocation sets in, with the basic idea being that if you work in a certain profession, then this is not just a job, it's your vocation, and vocation has a religious connotation in the sense that you are given this place in the division of labor to multiply God's sort of fruits or God's well-being already while being on earth. Understanding work in, let's say, these terms of vocation is one of the most central than micro mechanisms in Weber. A second one is an economic derivations of this. So as a consequence, then what Protestants do in terms of behavior is that they have this ascetic compulsion to save, as Weber puts it. That is, if you put it economically, they underconsume and they tend to reinvest, to save and reinvest, which is obviously good for a growing business. As a consequence also of this, thirdly, here then this means that the Protestants always remain active and don't indulge in any kind of leisure activity. And you may also wonder why this is the case, and this is where the predestination doctrine comes in. So the doctrine of predestination that Weber finds in the Protestant religions of various sorts says that on Earth, there's a subgroup of people who are chosen, or the selective few who are chosen for being basically saved in the afterlife already. And this is a selection that has taken place and which ironically cannot be changed anymore by the behaviors of the individual believers. If you buy into such a doctrine of predestination, it is obviously a little bit questionable why individual Protestants should still act according to religious sort of rules if they think that this kind of behavior cannot influence the selection anymore anyhow. So why is it that the individual Protestant believers still try to show on earth that they are worthy of God's sort of choice? Well, it's actually this. They are thrown into a kind of religion that has low degrees of collective organization. They are alone with their metaphysical uncertainty about whether they will be among the selected few or not. So the rationale is, well, if I was among the selected few, the chosen believers, then how would I act on earth? Well, probably I would already start multiplying God's glory here on earth and not leading a life of leisure and consumption. So in a way, the Protestants, not really knowing, being metaphysically uncertain about this choice already taken, bet on this idea that, good behavior is in a way the natural correlation of being among the selected few, and this is why one just has to keep active, has to multiply God's glory on earth, and so on. So all of these reasons lie more in the ideological doctrine of Protestantism and less so, again, in the religious organization. But you also find in Weber what nowadays we would call a social capital argument. That is, the organization of Protestantism as a religion has also certain, let's say, positive side effects for, let's say, the economic successfulness of Protestant sects. And here Weber mentions, for instance, the creditworthiness and mutuality principles that work better in tightly knit communities that share a common religion, right? If I know that you are the person to go to church every Sunday, that you're sort of doing what you're supposed to do, you work a lot, then I'm more inclined to advance trust and to give you a credit that you may pay back in the course of a couple of years. Whereas in less tightly knit communities, without that religious basis, this basis of trust might not be available, and other institutions would have to step in. Okay, so all of these different micro-mechanisms can explain why the individual Protestant here then engages in more, let's say, economic activity than his or her Catholic counterpart. But why would individually more economic activity then lead to modern capitalism? Well, this is the point where Weber's metaphor of the iron cage sets in. So the iron cage refers in a way to the pressure, the economic competitive pressure that your Protestant neighbors force upon you with their behavior when you as a Catholic also want to participate in the same economic life. Yeah, so, or in Weber's words here, quote, "The Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so. for when asceticism was carried out of monastic cells into everyday life and began to dominate worldly morality, it did its part in building the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order. This order is now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, which today determine the lives of all the individuals who are born into this mechanism. Not only those directly concerned with economic acquisition with irresistible force. Perhaps it will so determine them until the last ton of fossilized coal is burned. In Baxter's view, the care of external goods should only lie on the shoulders of the saint like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment, but fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage. End of quote. Okay, so this is the one instance where Weber uses the metaphor, and you see it is not as central as it became in the reception of Weber's work. I also chose this quote because Weber in a way makes an implicit and very up-to-date prediction about how the iron cage, in a way forces us into the problem of climate change nowadays, if you want. So probably couldn't be more up-to-date. Okay, so with that, we finished a little drawing here of Coleman's boat and hopefully arrived in the harbor of understanding. But I also wanted to mention as a final point that Weber did not understand this as a very monocausal kind of explanation. And you might have seen in the background of Weber's text that there are many institutions which Weber cites a little bit en passant, which also helps enabling the modern rational capitalism. And some of these institutions here are the rational calculation techniques. He mentions the double entry bookkeeping as an important accounting institution, the development of the modern applied sciences, amongst others, but also the institution of bourgeois citizens in free cities. Okay, so this is Weber's argument in a nutshell. And more than 100 years have passed ever since the publication of this work, and a lot of discussions have followed, and many emotional discussions as well. So here are just a couple of standard critiques that Weber's work had to endure. One very obvious critique that Steinert, for instance, mentions is the lack of empirical material. Weber cites one of his few PhD students in the work that shows some figures from Baden that try to make the point that, let's say, Protestants were overrepresented among the students of the more applied secondary schools, whereas the Catholics rather spent more time studying the ancient Greeks. These figures are even wrongly cited and themselves do not necessarily show a very significant impact. So overall, it is an essay, it is not a research paper. A more serious also critique is that Weber probably mischaracterizes Puritanism in the works, and he also misreads Benjamin Franklin, who is cited a lot for stating the doctrine of hard work. Franklin's work, this essay that is cited as much as others, is often very ironic. And Franklin himself is a very counterexample of this Protestant ethic, as he himself retired once he had gained enough wealth. So it is probably what can be called a corrupt citation. So also a serious problem with a much cited source in Weber. A more general problem is mentioned by Coleman, the Coleman boat Coleman here, who, yes, points to the fact that there may be problems with ecological fallacies and a missing microfoundation ecological fallacy refers to the problem that you may observe a correlation between aggregate numbers, for instance, let's say Protestants in a region and the